and it's 12:01, so I would say good afternoon, everyone, and a very welcome to today's webinar on community engagement and net zero. This webinar is part of the Net Zero Week, the UK National Awareness Week. We are really happy and delighted to have you with us. This session has been organized by the Open University and in particular the Centre for Social and Sustainable Enterprise within the Open University Business School. Today, we are going to explore the vital role that communities engagement play, and we think, and with all the speakers, we think in achieving net zero goals. Whether you are from academia, local government, non-profit organization, or industry, we really hope that this session offers important insights and sparks meaningful dialogue and potential future activities in your own organization. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers who will share their research experience and approaches to engaging communities in the transition to a low-carbon future. Without taking much more time to the amazing speakers we are today, to start our webinar, I would like to invite each of our panel members to briefly introduce themselves, what they do, their current work, and how this connects to today's topic. I will start with Dr. Alison Fox first, then we'll hear from Dr. Alina Kadyrova, and finally, we are going to have the introduction of Samanti Temini-Muller. Alison, over to you.
Thank you. So my name's Alison Fox. My title's Senior Lecturer in Teaching and Learning, where I've just finished a role as Associate Head of School for Research in the School of Education, Childhood, Youth and Sport. But my background is an environmental, mainly a soil scientist and an environmental science teacher in schools before I moved into higher education. One role that I hold, which is helping me to progress environmental sustainability in research across the Open University, is as chair of the Human Research Ethics Committee. But most relevant to today, my role is as lead of a project entitled Connecting Communities and Heritages Against Climate Change, which is a community-led initiative with partners in Kenya, Nigeria and Northern Scotland, using art with young people to connect with business leaders and policymakers through art for action or artivism. If I could just introduce my partners, I think there's a slide that Gabriella was going to just briefly share. And I'd like to introduce and acknowledge the key roles in this co-design partnership of those who can't join us today. So if you can move on to the next slide as well, please. So I'd like to introduce Lloyd Muriaki Wamai in Kenya at the African Alliance of the YMCA, Deborah Ayodele Oligeri at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and Katrina Willis from Highland One World Global Learning Centre in Scotland. And I'll be drawing on their thoughts in the presentations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison. Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Francesca. Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Kadyrova. I currently am a postdoctoral researcher in social and sustainable innovation at the Open University, and I work on a European-funded project called NCASE. We're going to share the link to the project after the webinar. So the project itself aims to improve the infrastructure and technology in the field of carbon capture, utilization and storage. And together with my colleague, we work with supporting community engagement and community co-creation activities by those organizations. In general, my interests are in innovation and specifically in innovation that addresses a societal need. You might have heard the term social innovation to describe those kind of activities before. And I research in different projects those innovations in their context, paying attention to the factors that facilitate or hinder the development of such innovations. And I also am interested in whether those innovations and new practices can challenge or change established way of working to make sure that we can progress to a more sustainable future and improve the well-being of people. My previous role was a lecturer in innovation at Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester, where I also studied different civil society initiatives driven by the non-profits in different European cities. Thank you, Francesca.
And Samanti.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. My name is Samanthi Tamini Muller. I'm a senior researcher at the Young Foundation, which is a charity. I work on our Just Transitions team, so we look at justice issues within the transition to net zero, particularly using participatory research and engagement approaches. I'm also spending most of my time working on a big research centre. The Young Foundation is the impact partner for the 5-year ESRC funded Just Centre, which is looking at social justice issues within the transition to net zero and wider sustainability transformations. That's led by the University of Manchester. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for introducing yourself and your work. I think it's great to have today a panel that combine academics that follow different research projects around community engagement, but as well non-profit organizations like the Young Foundation that actually engage with the communities in terms of transition. So I would move to the first discussion question of today. So if you can tell us about your work in the area of community engagement and net zero, but this time we'll go in reverse order. So let's start with Samanthi, then we'll hear from Alison, and finally Alina. Samanthi, over to you.
Thank you. So, like I said, we have a team at the Young Foundation that focuses on the just transition. And that work started 4 or 5 years ago now, with an exercise that we did across the country to build a community-driven research agenda. So we went across to different places and asked people, what do you want us to do research on? And one of the things, amongst many other things, was to understand how climate change and the transition to net zero would impact people's everyday lives. And particularly for those people who have less means and resources to deal with big changes, like the transition to net zero. So that was one of the things that we picked up and we ran with. So we did a piece of research with the University of York and the University of Leeds and Trinity College Dublin, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, to look at how what conditions and factors might make people more likely to be left behind in the transition to net zero. And 3 things came out of that work that's really influenced the follow-on work that we've done and the approaches that we like to take. So the first thing is we did a big, extensive literature review, bringing together lots of different disciplines and then also our primary research. And we really understood that the transition to net zero is going to affect all areas of our life. So it's typically put forward as a technological thing, an infrastructural thing, but it is also going to have impacts on how we socialize, on how we carry out caring responsibilities, on the food we eat, etc. And that means that if it's such a big change, people need to be involved in that change. People need to have agency over that change and be able to participate in it. So that was the first thing. The second thing was we could identify lots of different conditions and factors that affected whether people were able to participate, access, benefit from the transition to net zero. And generally speaking, you could kind of put those things as conditions and factors that related to individual people. So that might be their circumstances, factors about their identity, etc. And then also place conditions and factors. So where you live really played a role in how able you will be to participate in the transition to net zero. But importantly, those 2 things are really interconnected. So they're often seen as separate things. They're really interconnected. So that was the second thing, that you have to take a kind of whole picture of people's lives and the places that they live in order to understand how they will access and participate in and benefit from the transition to net zero. The third thing, in kind of keeping in mind those first 2 points, is we could really see the opportunity of the transition to net zero to address other existing inequalities that people face. And that's only really possible when you look at it from a justice and equity lens. So housing is a really good example of that. Retrofitting housing is a huge challenge within the transition to net zero. We have to do it. It will make a huge impact on reducing our emissions profile. On the other hand, people are day-to-day struggling with things like fuel poverty, with long-term health conditions that come from extreme levels of disrepair of housing. Both of those things can be tackled together, and you're then addressing challenges within the transition to net zero. You're addressing housing challenges, you're addressing health injustices, you're addressing economic injustices, etc. So the transition to net zero has this opportunity to speak to, tackle existing inequalities. However, at the moment, it's a bit of a risk because we're not starting from that point of equity and justice. And when you don't start from that point, what you actually have is a transition to net zero, inadvertently deepening or reproducing existing inequalities, and then maybe even creating new ones that are unique to the transition to net zero. So all of those three things in mind, we kind of have come to the conclusion that you really need to understand people's everyday lives in order for the transition to net zero to work. And in order to understand their lives, you have to talk to them. And that's why community engagement is really important in the transition to net zero. But we see community engagement as the absolute baseline. And we, in our work, we're trying to encourage more kind of meaningful and accountable opportunities to participate. So we try to model that in the work and the projects that we do. So we've recently done some work in London looking at more just retrofits. But then we also do projects and do work with decision makers and people who design strategies and things like that to influence them to create these meaningful and accountable opportunities to participate, or to help them kind of directly shape those opportunities. So to name drop a couple of projects that we've been working on to give you an idea. I mentioned the Just Retrofits work, which is looking at how you can better design the retrofit process. And retrofitting is adapting your home so it's more energy efficient and capable of dealing with changes from climate change. So we did some work in London looking at how people with protected characteristics might need their retrofit process to be better designed around their needs. We are working with local councils to bring in together lots and lots of different data sets, keeping in mind that kind of whole life, whole place approach that we've been talking about. Lots of different data sets to identify where to best kind of target their resources to help alleviate some of the existing inequalities that are experienced by the communities in the place that they're working. And then I mentioned earlier the Just Centre, so that's only just getting started, but that's a 5-year piece that is looking across the board at kind of social justice issues within the transition to net zero. And we'll drop some of those links, I think, in a follow-up later, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for this detailed overview of all the project. And of course, I mean, we are going to share links in the follow-up emails so people can have as well more information about the different part of research that Samantha and the activities that Samantha mentioned. So next one is going to be Alison.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll be talking about a smaller piece of work than Samantha's just presented, which is amazing. In our team, we're all inspired by taking seriously our commitment to children and young people's rights under the 2019 United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. Firstly, to express their views on matters which affect them, which is Article 12, and in ways that allow them to most fully express those opinions, Article 13. And the work on what we're calling artivism started in parallel in both Scotland and in Kenya. And we've been able to bring these practices together and introduce them into Nigeria. If I could have the next slide just for some visual images of what's happening in Scotland, Gabriella, please, that would be great. The activities in Scotland have been supported by the OU Scotland Partnership Team, along with the Pebble Trust, for the last 4 years. And they've been running mock COPs in schools across the Highlands and Islands region to encourage young people's engagement with the issues and policy making of the international COP events. Increasingly, the secondary school age children are taking leadership roles in the organisation and working with the primary schools. But Highland One World and OU Scotland started to introduce opportunities for the children to respond to those mock-ups through any forms of art they and their teachers chose, from performance as songs or dance, through sculpture to painting, drawing and collaging, and started to run from last year a post-COP exhibition. 537 artworks from 17 schools were created last year. And this was when the artwork started to really engage the public and policymakers. And it was this we picked up on as really powerful in overcoming the children and young people's lack of opportunity to influence policymaking directly, and to support them in their growing sense of eco-anxiety and frustration with the older generation about what needs to be achieved. The Scottish curriculum has got global citizenship and sustainability embedded throughout it, and Scotland has set an ambitious target to become net zero by 2045, 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. However, the young people are still frustrated by adults and not being heard. And art is proving to be a really direct and powerful way for them to express themselves and the urgency of their calls to action. We helped 600 children exhibit at the Inverness Botanica Gardens event, which you can see some snippets of in front of you in March this year, with 500 visitors and over 100 at a stakeholder event of policymakers, third-party organisations and business leaders. And the children there called very loudly for climate justice. They spoke about injustices they could see locally, and they weren't limiting themselves to their own experiences and their imagined futures, but they were calling leaders out as informed, active and vocal, although through visual means, citizens, although there is a very powerful song they created to start off the event. The event's been picked up by invitations to local councils to exhibit at Westminster, and it's been mentioned in the debate on fair trade in the Scottish Parliament. So if we can just move to the slide about Kenya. Thank you, Gabriella. The African Alliance of the YMCA are committed to empowering young people for what they term the African Renaissance, in particular those most marginalised and at risk of or after being involved in criminal activity, to act as change agents to find ways to drive the future of changing policies and practices. And the Alliance covers 13 national movements across Africa who've got a shared strategy to 2030. They cover 5 issues, and we connected with their work through on climate action. In parallel to their promotion of young people's green ideas, they've been working with young people to design climate games in 5 national settings for young people to educate and inspire climate action within those communities. We embrace game design as a form of expression in the arts, and since 2024, they've had masterclasses and facilitation from organisations like Think Place Kenya and the Africa Wildlife Foundation, and a series of climate games boot camps to design and test games funded through Bread for the World, some German funders. And games are being prepared to be launched with policymakers this summer, which we're supporting, and which is where we've become involved. Our partner, the University in Ibadan in Nigeria, has been working with those in Scotland and Kenya to initiate a climate artivism initiative in schools in the capital, Abuja. And they took their artifacts to policymakers and gathered in Abuja on a Friday last week. This will then, with further funding, be taken out into other regions of Nigeria whose communities are affected by climate change in different ways. I'm sorry, I should have asked for the next slide, where my partner in Nigeria has shown you some images of the effects, and where children's voices are marginalised in different ways across Nigerian society in the different regions. So it's been really important in each of these cases that the children and young people took their own artworks and engaged directly with the policymakers in each venue, and they called those policymakers and business leaders to commit to pledges of action. And we're researching the process of this co-design. We've used a range of tools to engage children and young people during the making process, and we've been researching the showing phase. We've designed a range of tools to engage with those who are attending and responding to the art, but principally we need to make sure they're not one-off events, and we're seeking funding to continue to amplify the children's voices and support them as climate ambassadors. And one of the secondary school students who spoke at the Inverness event, which I want to finish on, concluded and reflected that the artwork gives a colourful and simplified way of inspiring talk. It's really good to do this with other people and to speak to them on a shared interest in front of the exhibits. It's an indirect way to talk about the importance of the issues that are affecting all of our lives and that we're learning about. The artworks seem to be making the topic approachable, and it's allowing for intergenerational discussions, but based on our ideas. Thank you for the space to introduce the project, and I think I'll hand back to Francesca to hand to Alina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alison. I think, I heard about this project some months ago in an internal event, and I was super fascinated by the possibility of giving the voice to the kids, but as well the collaboration among different country and different university in different country and building together through art. So thank you so much, Alison, for sharing with us. And over to you, Alina.
Thank you very much, Francesca, Samantha, and Alison. So I will talk a little bit about the project that I'm working in and what we do, and then I'm going to give you a few examples of the community engagement work that we facilitate. So as I mentioned, I work on the European project, which is called ENCASE. And the project itself is a highly technical project because it includes engineering teams and research teams that work on the different aspects of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And we, as Open University, is a social science partner in this project, and our role focuses on supporting the project partners in implementing community engagement processes, which we also get to evaluate. I have joined this project as a postdoctoral researcher, and I think it is a very interesting setting where the teams and people who are engineers who have very limited prior exposure or any experience with the community engagement or community actors, they get to develop and they get to engage with the communities and think about different social issues that they can address as a part of their work. So this kind of work is very interesting from the perspective of the academic research, where there's still very limited knowledge and very limited longitudinal evidence that follows the decisions made in those projects, especially in business organizations. So we see a lot of research being done on the community groups and on the nonprofits and how they collaborate and how they engage with communities on net zero, while in terms of the businesses, it's the knowledge is a bit limited. So it's very interesting from the knowledge perspective, but also from the practical perspective, because at least in the area of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it's not yet in similar organizations, it's not yet a widespread activity to work with communities, to work with civil society organizations, even though it holds, I think, a very enormous potential from the perspective of facilitating and accelerating net zero transitions and creating social impact. So in our work, in our project, we have 5 engineering organizations across Europe who developed different community co-creation and community engagement projects. Those organizations are located in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Norway, in France, and in the UK. And you can learn a bit more about their different activities on the project website, where we update and where we put some pictures and share the progress of those co-creation activities. But I can give you a few examples of two such projects. So one project is from Norway, and the team in Norway, they focused on the very kind of important issue connected to the lack of young adults choosing STEM professions, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So that issue is very important for the future generations working in net zero technologies. So they have focused and they wanted to address this problem of the lack of young people in STEM professions by targeting the secondary and high school in the area where they are located. So they have decided to collaborate with an expert on micrometeorites, which are micrometeorites are like a tiny particles of the meteorites that you can see on different surfaces. So as a part of the project, they went to different schools, and together with the kids, they went on the roof of the school. They collected dust, and then the kids got to look at the dust particles under the microscope, and they could find micrometeorites. And those activities were they're very engaging and they're very interesting to the school children. And now many different schools in the area contacted our partner for more workshops because the kids get to learn and get to meet engineers, and they get to do this very exciting interactive exercise where they find and they can see by themselves the micrometeorites. So this kind of work increases engagement of young adults and children, and it shows different options and kind of different activities that engineers and scientists do, and it introduces them to real engineers and scientists who work in the area of CCOS on net zero broadly. My second example is from the UK, where the organization there that we worked with, they have decided to address an issue of lack of knowledge in the technologies of CCOS, and they wanted to increase their embeddedness and their connections to the local stakeholders. So what this organization did is that they have co-created a children's book on CCOS where the engineers wrote the plot, the story of the book, and then they contacted a local school where primary school kids got to illustrate the book. So it was very interesting and interactive activity where the kids got to visit the location of this engineering organizations, and the kids got to meet the engineers and learn what engineers do and meet different people and kind of learn a bit more about climate change and net zero and different technologies such as CCOS. So this work with local school, it's going to continue, and it's very interesting and nice to see for us how this temporary engagement with a local stakeholder resulted in a long-term association, because the school and engineers are going to continue engagements around the book, and also in the future continuing the school visits and kind of the introduction of engineering work and the work on CCOS with the local stakeholders. So these are some examples from our work, and you can get to know a bit more about those and other areas and other problems that different partners addressed on the website. Yeah, thank you. Francesca, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alina. And just, because I work with Alina on the project, we hope to be able to present the co-created book that it was involved the primary school children in the story and the primary school teacher, and it was read to the entire school. Basically, the kids read the story and show the illustration to the entire school and collect the feedback, modify the book. So we hope to present this book maybe next year inside this event. And possibly we are going to distribute it to library in schools. So for the next part of our discussion, I would like to shift a bit the focus towards what you learn in terms of potential suggestions that you would like to share with our audience about how to make collaboration more effective. So what do you suggest stakeholders such as policymakers, nonprofit and business can do to co-work more effectively in this area to help achieve net zero? We'll begin with Alina. So I'm shuffling around the speakers to give everybody the different orders. And then we will hear from Samanti and finally from Alison. So Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, so continuing what I just mentioned, and I can just share our experience of working with business organizations, because this is what we do. So my observations are going to primarily focus on the business organizations that we engage with. So first of all, of course, the main point here is the thinking about the net zero. It is important to involve different types of organizations and different types of stakeholders, because if we want to continue and if we want to move to the just future and more sustainable future, it is important to hear from different types of stakeholders and organizations, so not just one, and make sure that everyone's voice is heard. In relation to the business organizations, I think for them, to think and maybe engage more with communities, it is important to reflect on why it matters and kind of zoom out a bit from their activities and see themselves as a part of the system and see themselves surrounded by many different organizations and many different stakeholders that they affect directly or indirectly through their activities, including, for example, their direct neighbors in where they're located, but also direct and indirect users of the products and services and broader activities that they have. In working with the engineers and scientists or people who work in the lab or who don't directly engage with communities, I think sometimes they have this idea that it's not their job and it's not up to them to do community engagement, and they don't always see communities as the stakeholders. While in reality, I think communities are important stakeholders because from the stories that we can hear on the news, we can see how the lack of community engagement and the lack of community inclusion and the lack of trust between communities and the organizations can really become a barrier for the implementation of some of the infrastructures and technologies that can accelerate net zero and mitigate the climate change impacts. So just a few examples. We know from the renewable energy infrastructure area, there are examples such as Not in My Backyard movement against the wind turbines, and from the area of CCUS, we've heard examples from European countries such as France, where the entire projects of deploying the infrastructure were blocked or stopped because of communities not being on board, because they were not being included or counted. So this kind of aspect where community voice and hearing what they get to say, especially in areas where infrastructure is due to be implemented, it is really important to make sure that all the developments are safe and just and fair for different parties involved. But also from the business perspective, it facilitates the implementation of those projects, and it increases the trust. It increases the cohesion in the local areas, which are very important for us as a society to move forward. So I want to say also from the internal point of view, the community engagement exercises are also could be very important for the engineers themselves, who get to engage in the very different types of roles and tasks that they normally do. And from what we saw initially, of course, they were very kind of skeptical about those engagements, but then this task of community engagement, it helped them to come up with really great ideas and with really influential projects. And just looking internally, they could find opportunities and resources and ideas to engage the local stakeholders and address a broad range of societal issues that are related to net zero, including the raising awareness in the technologies that they're working on, including, for example, increasing awareness of their organizational mission and what they do, but also addressing problems such as inclusion of different groups of people in some technologies and inclusion of different groups of people in decision making. Probably my last comment, and more from the practical point of view, we saw that engaging kind of an intermediary professionals such as the non-profits or people who, for example, work for schools or who have this kind of experience of working for the community groups or with community groups, it helps because it helps to bridge different perspectives and different points of view. So, for example, in one of the examples that I mentioned before in the UK, the team involved a person who was a former primary school teacher who helped to connect the engineers with the primary school children. And this was a very important facilitating factor that helped engineers kind of see the point and get to engage with the kids without necessarily having doing it themselves, but acting through the proxy and involving an intermediary actor helps to unite and bridge different types of outlooks and views, and helps to create a conversation between different actors. So these are my reflections. Thank you, Francesca. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Elena. And I think now we are going to hear from Samanthi.
Thank you. And you'll be pleased to hear that a lot of it overlaps with what Elena said, which is more reason to do it. So the first thing, again, is we'll always hammer home is that we need to be looking at the transition as a just transition. And unfortunately, that isn't the starting point for a lot of people. But when it comes to community engagement, thinking about transition through the lens of justice and equity gives you so many more opportunities to connect with people and to encourage people to want to take part in the transition, because they can relate it to different parts of their lives. So like I said, with the housing example, you're bringing together transition, housing, health, etc. And that means that you can talk about the transition to net zero through any of these 3 or 4 challenges or issues that people are facing. So not only is justice and equity the correct starting point to start with, it is a really impactful, powerful engagement tool for bringing more people along on the ride. So the just transition is the first thing. The second, so that is also kind of relevant to everyone that works on the transition to net zero, whether you're whether you're kind of a national policymaker designing a new policy, whether you're local government trying to figure out how to best implement that policy at a local level. You might be a business or an investor trying to figure out where to put your money in for what reason, and what you want to achieve. You might be a third sector or charity organization trying to design a program that meets the needs of your local community. So kind of that call for the just transition really cuts across a lot of different stakeholders. The second thing that we would suggest is, and I said this earlier, is to really create opportunities for that meaningful, accountable participation in the transition. So you want people to have those opportunities to really influence and shape how the transition is delivered, what it feels like, how it's experienced, and who gets to play a role. And more importantly, ideally, what you're looking to is not just kind of these one-off opportunities to engage, like Alina kind of mentioned earlier as well, but to build kind of infrastructure within organizations, within governments, etc. So you can engage on an ongoing basis in a way that people can kind of really follow through with. And that is again relevant to lots of different stakeholders, and Alina gave some really great examples of why. The third thing that we would suggest is trying to work in a more kind of joined up way. So I talked earlier about this, the transition to net zero affecting our whole lives, so lots of different areas of our lives. At the moment, net zero policy and net zero implementation is siloed into sectors or departments. So this is particularly relevant for governments, for policymakers, but definitely can include some others. Transport thinks about transport, housing thinks about housing, and that's how policy is designed and implemented. When I think about transport, I'm thinking about how I get around, about work, about how I'm going to pick up my groceries, all of that stuff, how I'm going to socialize. Working kind of in this siloed way is not reflective of how we experience everyday life and how we make the connections ourselves. And net zero policy and programs and strategies need to reflect that. And again, the best way to do that is to talk to people and understand like how the different parts of their lives connect and how that can be reflected in net zero policy and practice. And then the final thing, I guess, is there's a lot of people on this call and you're from all different types of backgrounds. But I guess a call from us is to take part in those engagement opportunities when they come up, but also to not be afraid to be too critical of them. If you feel like they aren't meaningful, aren't influential, aren't redistributive in decision making and in power, whatever, then don't be afraid to call out the people that are designing those community engagement opportunities, because often sometimes community engagement can be a tick box, and other times it is like a real, there's good intention behind it, there's goodwill, and people just need help to figure out how exactly to design those opportunities to best meet you in the middle. So my fourth suggestion would be to kind of the general public to really take up on those opportunities to engage with those that are making decisions, that are designing initiatives, etc.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and over to Alison.
Okay, thanks, Samantha and Alina. I think we're going to be calling the same things forward from the communities that we've been working with, and I want to amplify what the children and young people have been calling for. Particularly, as I say, a lot of the work has been done in Scotland so far. And I was looking at Holly Gillibrand's piece in a Children in Scotland magazine in 2020, so already 5 years ago, calling for, we need action now. We need to hold politicians to account. We need to understand the impacts of climate change. Education at school is only part of that, but we want to be part of making the change happen. It's our future and we don't want to be excluded. And the children in our project have been the same 5 years later. And like Alina and Samantha have been saying, they are asking us for taking a much stronger climate justice stance. They don't see net zero, they don't see the boundaries, they don't see net zero as the only target, but they're asking us and those in positions to make policies to accept and show that it's a complex and intersectional set of targets that need to be explored together through people's lives, rather than making single action policies which seem to make the choices simple and uncontested. And they were talking, for example, about the push to electric vehicles. A strong message coming out of the project in Kenya is the challenge to adults about how young people are going to make a sustainable livelihood in this world. When you're adding to their responsibilities, that they're becoming aware that they should be committed to local, regional and global climate justice. So they were much more interested in adaptation to the climate situation in Kenya than mitigation in some of the other settings. And we are trying to get the settings together. But they wanted to call all of those in positions of being able to employ them and give them roles in society as to how they're going to be sustainable roles. One of the exhibits that I want to just draw to attention, and then I've got some sort of more punchy strategies, is that the children in Scotland, in challenging us in our responsibility to others, use an Inukshik structure, which is a structure made of stones as a sort of landmark. And they got the children to come from all their regions with stones to build this structure. And they drew this from the Inuit tradition, and they felt they wanted to show their solidarity as a northern peoples, of peoples that are very likely to not be included in the planning at all for the transition to net zero. And they marked on a chalk drawing of their Inukshuk landmark whose voices are heard and who is silenced. So some of their thoughts and the thoughts of educators and others that are involved in the project for communities are really to accept and acknowledge this climate anxiety as something that we've talked, I think, already about well-being. The Highland One World Global Learning Centre have got some really great resources, multimedia resources, and also a Padlet wall, all sorts of things they've gathered as to practically how to do this, and we're sharing the link with that afterwards. But they really wanted to show that more than 50% of those in this Lancet study that people might have come across, of over 10,000 children across 10 countries, have been reporting feeling sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless and guilty. And so what the young people are calling for is spaces for young people to voice that climate anxiety. Also in those resources that Highland One World have created, it's needing spaces for the adults to also reflect on their frustrations. The children and young people are needing adults to model what it means to think green, and not just in their education, in their curriculum, but in beyond school, across their communities. They'd also like it to be advertised how individual actions can be powerful collectively together. They want opportunities which reconnect people with nature and getting outdoors to support everybody feeling positive about the mental health, but also commitment to their local area to enhance projects. There's some other amazing work in the Open University at the moment. For example, the urban greening for heat resilient neighbourhoods in Scotland, led by Leslie Mabon in our School of Engineering and Innovation, and also some work in the Amazon on villager-led sustainability, if you want to look up those projects afterwards. But they're asking for opportunities at local level for them to be able to show their agency, to be involved in the planning and the carrying out of these activities. Less focus on ice caps and more on litter collection, beach cleaning, recycling, tree planting as an active citizen. For policymakers, the children want to speak directly to and work with them. When they spoke in the speeches at the beginning of the Inverness event, they were talking about damp housing as an untackled issue. They wanted to talk about how people were made to feel very guilty about their use of cars in rural communities when there wasn't an adequate public transport, and they were asking people in that space to resolve those contradictions as part. So this picks up on what Samantha was saying about of their lives and the lives of others, and they're very generous in speaking about and for others that they didn't feel could lobby themselves, having been given that space. So they want to ask policymakers to engage communities at regional level. They want them to use art, to engage with artists in the community. And there's another project I'm involved with at the moment, which is Horizon Europe project with performing artists. And there were some lovely examples at an event I went to last week about artists coming in and being able to use movement of the children with the local community to move things around that had been taken from the environment and were taken back to the environment to think about the transition to net zero. But they also need the policymakers to be open-minded when listening, to actually listen and not expect and hope that the community and the people drawn together will come to the same conclusions as their policies have come to, but to actually listen to other solutions and to work with them with that sort of ethics of care, of being listened to, and then a feedback loop of them seeing something happen. And policymakers working with educators, there's so many roles that you can support, not just the curriculum, but the CPD for teachers in allowing them spaces to reflect on their relationship with the climate and their role in supporting climate education. They want policymakers to support a rights-based curriculum, of which Scotland has a wonderful example. And they want to avoid limiting initiatives to the easy and tokenistic. One of the parents at the Inverness event said wearily, I imagine people will be committing to acts like cycling more, turning off their lights, but what we need is a sustained energy to make changes, which isn't possible when politicians don't stay long in posts. If we had an environment minister for 20 years, maybe we could be making more progress. And other educators in that space are saying, I've been doing this 20 years and I'm seeing something different as these children are given these spaces. And it's great that the MEPs and the Scottish members of Parliament have come to these spaces. And finally, just a couple of thoughts for companies. Please reach out, as Alina and Samantha have been saying, and engage with schools, with other parts of the community. Maybe look out for those young activists to help amplify their voices. There's some lovely examples in the Highland One World materials of young activists to try and help them see their vision through. And there's in Scotland, there's some lovely examples of the Children's Parliament, the Youth Parliament. Children in Scotland have an advisory group, Changing Our Lives. So that would be really fertile ground for investment. And be prepared to learn from the young people. I've got quotes from third sector representatives and business leaders from the organisation if people want to follow up afterwards on people's reactions to these events. So thank you for the space.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Back to you, Francesca.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alison, and thank you, Samantha and Alina, too, for the incredible discussion so far and the different suggestions that you come out from different angles. So we had some pre-submitted questions. Actually, we had quite a lot of pre-submitted questions, so it was really challenging to select 3. And I noticed that there is a question in the chat that I think that it can talk as well to 1 or 2 of the pre-selected questions. So So the first question, based on our conversation, I selected three pre-submitted questions that can be related to each of you, but please also the others feel free to respond. And so the first question is gonna be for Samantha, and I think that is the question that resonates with the Jane question as well in the chat. So the question is, how do you manage conversation with community members who recognize climate change as an issue, but don't prioritize climate action because they are focused on more immediate concerns like housing, unemployment, or cost of living? And Jane in the chat ask how and if it happened to some of us to experience that people were not really, the groups of people refused completely to engage, maybe because they were more they have other priorities in that point of life. So Samantha, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I really like the question because some of the answers in the question, it's really an issue of, or like a challenge of framing and language and thinking about what's important to people. So like this person has said, we're firefighting so many different immediate challenges, right? Like, can we pay our energy bills? Do we have enough food on the table? Why is public transport not working properly? And then you have transition to net zero coming in, which feels very far away because it is typically spoken about with the framing of technology and of infrastructure, maybe a business, but it doesn't feel like something that is immediately impacting our everyday lives. So it's very easy to deprioritize it because you simply don't have the headspace or the resources to think about it, to address it, whatever. But then that's why I'd bring it back to that point that I was making, where if you think about it through a justice and equity lens, you can start to link it to other issues, and that might be the way that you engage with people who feel like they don't have the space to engage with it. So if you kind of get into the world of people who talk about the transition to net zero as like a day job, for example, you'll hear the word co-benefits a lot. So people are trying to identify where there are co-benefits to the transition to net zero, and things like health and housing have been identified. But then when you talk to everyday people in their everyday settings, the main benefit is health and housing, and the co-benefit is a transition to net zero. They don't want to talk so much about the transition to net zero if they can't talk about those other issues, and that's very legitimate. With the piece of work we did around retrofitting, even when people fully understood the benefits, the needs to retrofit, there was still kind of pushback on doing the actual retrofitting process for lots of different reasons, but for some of them being you're ignoring the immediate issues that we've been talking about for weeks, months, years, and asking us to instead engage in a different issue. So I've been talking about the damp and mold in my house for months, which has gone unaddressed, but you want to come in and put in a heat pump. Why can't you do both of those things? If you're going to cause so much disruption to my everyday life by putting in these other adaptations, why can't you also deal with this other problem that is causing me serious issues and that no one is listening to me about? So it's about kind of legitimizing those other challenges that people want to talk about, holding them in equal importance, particularly when you can address both through things like the transition to net zero. And then ultimately, like kind of relating to Jane's question as well in the chat, the transition to net zero, it has become a really divisive political toy. And in some cases, it might be best to just not talk about the transition to net zero, especially in those words. It's something that we're definitely reflecting on within the team. Is it more dangerous to play with that language? And what other language might be better? And what framing resonates with people more in a way that is that doesn't patronize them or doesn't downplay the challenges of their everyday life. So think about what the different benefits are, thinking about the framing, think about the language.
Thank you, Samantha. And Alison, how can children and young people be engaged with projects that will impact their future in truly collaborative, non-tokenistic way?
Great, yeah, thank you. And I guess I've spoken to that already, so I'm just trying to think what to add to that. I think the curriculum in schools reaches everybody in formal schooling, and that's not a given that needs to be thought about. But I think extending to other spaces for children and young people where they are, youth organisations like, we're working with the YMCA, sports organisations, guiding and scouting, places where they are, if it could be embedded into the actions and the activities they see and live all around them, and they can see the changes that are being made, by local councils, by those that are organising those institutions. They need opportunities to express themselves, and I think that's where we may be not hearing from all of those that we could. And movement and creativity are tools that they can speak with so powerfully, and that was so impactful watching visitors at the exhibition. So spaces to do that in their communities, not and the Botanic Gardens was a great idea to really allow them to have their rights under Article 13 of the United Nations Convention. So involving them, I think I said before, in designing, planning the activities meaningfully, creating reflective spaces as well as acting spaces, and expect them not to see boundaries, expect to hear something new, be prepared to listen, but be prepared to act on what they are saying, because they're very frustrated that they can't see the feedback loop, and they need to be valued. And they're saying many of the things that we've heard today, but they can't see the changes, and they're calling for the same things. Thanks, Francesca.
Thanks, Alison. And as a closing line before concluding remarks, Alina, how can we ensure that community engagement in net zero moves beyond consultation and becomes a genuine long-term partnership, especially when we work with organizations that are already stretched or under-resourced?
Thank you, Francesca. So first, my first thought and my first suggestion here is, of course, the obvious about the proper resourcing of the community engagement processes, given how important it is to include different voices and different types of organizations involved in decision making. So the proper resourcing that I mean could include the funding and then the capacity and the structures, for example, within businesses, and then the time and the space, as Alison and Samantha were mentioning, for community and different people to get together and reflect and decide. But I also see two other important points. The first one is a mindset shift. So it's not just about having the program of community engagement, but also understanding why it is important, and the seeing for the organizations of people who get to do community engagement, seeing it not just a burden or kind of the box ticking exercise or just a one-way lecture or an informational session, but also seeing it as a source of new ideas and a source of new pathways and new ways of working. Because we can often see, especially around the engaging communities and on the topic of technologies, that people see them as not knowing or not understanding things, or someone else knows better what to do or what communities need. So kind of reframing this and seeing communities as and hearing what they say, and kind of legitimizing what they say as valid points, and understanding their point of view is important. And on a related aspect of it is setting up the long-term collaborative governance and partnership schemes where different stakeholders understand and they get to meet together, and they can work under the joint accountability mechanisms where communities or different organizations can hold each other accountable for the decision making in the short term, but also in the long term, considering the change in the political parties, in the leadership teams, so kind of the structure that can carry development long term, and where the partners can agree and work on a set of agreed targets and goals.
Thank you so much. I'm aware of time, so that brings us to the end of today's webinar on community engagement net zero. I want to give a huge thank you to our panelists. I think it was great, and it was great to hear from all your experience, your project, your vision, and your suggestion. I want as well to thank my colleague, Dr. Raquel Vaga, that is the director of the Center for Social and Sustainable Enterprise, Gabriella Darozzi, and Victoria Hans to organize the events with us. And thank you, everyone that joined us today. We hope that you're living with new ideas, perspective, and potential activities to implement in your own work and your own organization. If you would like to continue the conversation, we are all of us very happy if you want to connect with us via email or LinkedIn, and keep an eye out for the follow-up resources that will be shared in the recordings from today's session. To conclude, more webinars are taking place across the week. For more information, visit netzeroweek.com/business, and you can see all the other events. Goodbye and take care.